I think it's worth giving a bit of reminder, or at least touch on what exactly is this Visual Effects database used for. Especially from a Visual Effects coordinator's point of view, since it's the VFX coordinator that's going to pretty much maintain the Visual Effects database. So really, it's the administration of Visual Effects information and data. It's also administration of client feedback and notes. And lastly, if you are going to be using a Visual Effects database, whether it's Shotgun, F-Track like we're using today, or FileMaker, or whatever software solution you decide to use, you want to avoid re-entry of any data. I've seen producers have Excel spreadsheets because they're so used to it, but as well as putting that same data and retyping it into the Visual Effects database because the company's bought a Visual Effects database, they have to use it. That's really bad use of Visual Effects database. Either you stick with your spreadsheet or you go with a Visual Effects database. You don't have both because you want to avoid re-entry of any data. That's the whole purpose of using software like F-Track, is to avoid any re-entry of any data, and therefore you have more time to actually run the project and check out cool shots and do your job. Lastly is to track the information and its use. The information in terms of like the visual effects plates, the shot numbers, and so on. Naming conventions, very important. Even when you're an artist, you are constantly making sure that your name conventions are as correct as you can, but especially with production, we're very strict on that. Not because we're very Nazi about the whole thing. It's mostly because it saves us a lot of hassle later on, for things like backing up, for things like tracking the status for shots, or version control, or looking for things, just generally for looking for things. Can you imagine you're working on a show and it has like 200 shots, for example, or you're working on multiple shots, multiple shows which have multiple shots, and you need to look for things. You need to look for them very quickly, and you want to make sure things are concise and clear. And the more organized you are, the less stress you have, and less white hair you grow. So with file name conventions, every studio you go to, they have their own set of sort of like the way they name things. But in terms of the basic foundations, the foundations are the same regardless of what country you work in, what studio you work in, what language you speak in. It's still the same foundations. And that's the foundation, which is pretty much the show name, the sequence name, the scene number, shot number. So that might be a little bit confusing. So basically what I mean is, if you look, for example, you have a show name, which could be drones, the sequence name or the scene number. That could be the sequence, so it can be like jungle 0010 and the shot number 0010. Now, the reason I put sequence name and scene number, because different studios use different terminologies. I've been at some companies, they call them sequences, some companies call them scenes. Most of the time they call them scenes because when they do the script breakdown, when a producer breaks down a script, the script is provided with scene numbers, so that gets translated into the bidding sheet. But just to let you know, sequence name is the same as scene number and vice versa. So in the example here, you have drone, then you have the interior 10, which is the sequence, and then you have 0 to 10, the shot. I get questions all the time by people going, why are you setting up your shots starting it with shot 10? Why not start with shot 1? Because that's the first shot. As logical as that sounds, really, most of the time during production, more shots get added. And if you want to add shots in between 1 and 2, because things happen during editorial, you may be given a shot, an edit with loads of shots, but most of the time they are re-editing and they're inserting shots in the edit. And therefore, if you're working on a sequence of shot 1, 2, 3, and they insert a shot between 1 and 2, you can't call something 1.5, 1.3, because it just doesn't work with naming conventions, and even software doesn't like having decimal points in between things. You use underscores. So if you start with shot 10, at least you have 9 shots before that to insert, and 9 shots after to insert. So you have more to play with. And also, lastly, you have frame padding. So you're having 3 digits, 0, 1, 0. I rarely go more than 4 frame padding unless it's like an uber massive show, which is probably very rare to happen. So this is why you stick with a 3 or 4 naming convention in terms of 0010 or for the frame padding 0000. Okay, lastly, because we're going to be putting in a lot of numbers into your Visual Effects database, sometimes you, as a VFX coordinator or a VFX producer, gets given a load of data and you've got to fill it in really quickly, and there's no creatives around or no supervisors around. What do you put? You can't just make up some numbers, right? So I always have a 3-day rule. If you don't really understand what's involved in the shot, or you think it's quite complicated, there might be some 3D, there might be some miniatures, this could be a complete CGI shot, you're not sure, stick with the 3-day rule. And pretty much day 1, you're doing the shot, or the artist is doing the shot. Day 2, tweaks and client revisions. And day 3 is your buffer and contingency. Now, obviously, not every shot has the luxury of having a minimum 3 days. But if you stick with that minimum rule, it just means when you do create a bid or a database with a bunch of shots with bid numbers in there, it makes kind of sense. And it's enough for you to play with. Because the last thing you want to do is put some random numbers in there and the client goes, what was you thinking? 5 days for that shot? And at least you can say, well, I'll put the minimum in there and it'll make sense. Lastly, if you're unsure about technical or creative methodology of a shot that you're currently bidding, then please consult with a senior artist, CG or VFX supervisor. If none of them are around, then stick with a 3-day minimum bid, which is on the sheet. And then before you submit the bid, consult next day when the supervisor is around.